Strangers by Taichi Yamada. Translated by Wayne Lammers. Chapter 7. That evening, a violent thunderstorm passed over the city. I watched the driving rain and lightning from a bar on the top floor of a high-rise hotel. The rain dashed against the glass in torrents, making the window a blur. It turned the jagged bolts of lightning stabbing at the earth into nothing more than diffuse flickers, which irritated me a little. I ached to smash the massive pane and see the lightning bolts descend in all their piercing brilliance. I longed to distance myself from anything ambiguous, anything non-transparent, anything belonging to darkness. I wanted to be in a world where all was bright and clean and in sharp focus. Precisely for that reason, I had steered clear of basement and ground-level establishments to seek out brighter environs, high in the sky, but thanks to thunderclouds, abetted by the gathering dusk, the realm of darkness had encroached moment by moment upon my world even here. I dreaded going home and having to face my empty apartment alone. Not that I had anything to fear from the apartment itself, of course. What I needed to fear was my own self. I knew that perfectly well. I remained at an utter loss how to explain the hallucinations I was having of my long-dead parents suddenly reappearing before me in exactly the image I had of them when they died. Not for the most fleeting of moments had my visit today seemed like a hallucination. My mother had appeared before me as a discreet other, as vivid and physically real as the whiskey glass into which I now gazed. How could I believe that she had been purely a figment of my imagination? She had even served me beer, from which a warm and pleasant feeling of intoxication had lingered in my body until only a short time ago. Yet, none of it could possibly have been real. I had to have imagined the whole thing. And what was more, it seemed I lacked the ability or power to free myself of these hallucinations, to heal myself of whatever might be causing them. A feeling of helplessness gnawed at the pit of my stomach. I did not doubt that losing my parents at the tender age of 12 had left me with certain emotional scars. But I knew that even those who reached adulthood with both parents intact bore childhood wounds of one kind or another, so I had always figured I was pretty much the same as everyone else in having old baggage to contend with. The difference, to my mind, was in how well a person controlled and tamed the unfortunate legacies of his birth and childhood as he proceeded on through his adult life, and, for my own part, I believed that I had long since resolved such matters and put them behind me. Never had I anticipated that they might suddenly rear their heads in this form. I could only suppose that these hallucinations manifested a subconscious hunger for something that had been left unfulfilled because I lost my parents at such a young age. On a conscious level, certainly, I had considered myself to be mostly free of such desires, yet when I thought of the soothing sense of security I felt in the couple's presence, I could conclude but one thing. Somewhere deep inside of me, I had been yearning desperately for the warm embrace of parental love. It would reasonably follow, then, that this hidden yearning had risen to the surface in the form of hallucinations in the days of solitude following my divorce. Yet, truth be told, I had great difficulty accepting this as a satisfactory explanation of what I had experienced. Could a hallucination really feel so vividly real? If my imagination had made up the events in Asakusa today, then this bar, this entire hotel, and even the thunder and lightning and rain outside this window had to be its product as well. I was as certain of my mother's presence with me in that apartment this afternoon as I was of the people and furnishings surrounding me in this bar now, and the same was true for my father the other night. There could be no denying the palpable reality. Whatever the truth of the matter, I needed to deal with it calmly. I didn't want to believe it possible, but I feared this experience might portend an impending nervous collapse, a breakdown triggered by a deep-seated weakness in me. If so, I had to find some way to forestall it. The last thing I needed right now was another drink, I realized. What I did need was to go on home and get back to work. My best chance for fighting off these hallucinations could well be in sticking to my normal routine and refusing to let it be disrupted. I caught a cab back to my apartment. By the time we pulled up at the entrance, the storm had passed. A brilliant moon shone down on the nearly empty parking lot. As I rode up in the elevator, I decided my first act would be to turn on every light in the apartment, not only the overheads, but the ones on my desk, on my bedstand, and in the bathroom. Somehow I needed to drive off the terror that had followed me all the way from Asakusa. I still cringed recalling the words, "What child asks his own parents their name?" I opened the door to the dark apartment and flicked the switch for the living room light. The bedroom light came next, then the small lamp on my nightstand and my desk lamp and the light in the toilet. Then I froze in panic. The light in the bath compartment failed to come on. I flicked the switch back and forth several more times, but darkness persisted. Suddenly, I sensed an eerie presence lurking there. Terror gripped me as I awaited the grotesque hand that would come reaching slowly up out of the tub, followed by an arm, then a face, and then at last the full figure of a ghoulish monster standing there glaring at me. My mouth wide open, gasping for breath, I slammed the door shut. It was all I could do to keep from screaming. Stop being ridiculous. It's only a burnt-out light bulb. That's all. Why should I be standing here quaking in fear? But even as I tried to reassure myself, I remained petrified with fright. Petrified, but hearing something. The sound of, what could it be? Oh, it's the intercom. The chime on the intercom. Nothing strange about that. Someone's at the door pushing my doorbell. Nothing wrong with that. But who? Suppose it's my father. Or my mother. I want to answer. I realized I was letting wave after wave of terror wash over me as I flailed helplessly about, and I hated myself for it. Get a hold of yourself. I hissed and lifted the handset. Hi. It's me, Kay said. I couldn't have been more relieved. I opened the door and found her standing there in a pale green blouse and yellow skirt. "Can I come in?" she asked, tilting her head a little to one side. I chose not to tell Kay about the day's events. I really wasn't sure what people normally did at times like this. I wondered if maybe I was being paranoid, and several times I almost started to confide in her, but each time I found myself holding back. It wasn't as if I'd been accosted and mugged on the street. The hallucinations I had experienced might owe to a personal infirmity, and I did not want Kay to see me cowering in fear before something I could not understand. "I saw you from the window when you came inside a while ago," she said. "You looked so pale and worn out. I was worried." "It's probably only because the moon was so bright," I said, making light of her worries. "I don't feel the least bit tired." She was 33, and as a man 15 years her elder, I instinctively tried to conceal any signs of flagging vitality. "Are you sure?" She was in my arms. "You didn't seem quite normal somehow." "Ooh," I squealed mockingly, and was there some kind of ghostly aura hovering about me, too, maybe? My tone was joking, but I had in fact taken her remark more than half seriously. The sharpness of a woman's intuition is legendary. "Actually, yes," Kay said. "This may sound spooky, but it almost seemed like you were off in another dimension or something. Or maybe like I was an apparition?" "Yes, like you were an apparition. And that's why I half expected not to find you home when I rang your doorbell. So, do you think I'm an apparition now?" "Hardly. Not with a nose hair sticking out like that." We both laughed and fell into a passionate embrace. She insisted again that I must not touch or see her chest, so for a second time I began our act of love by wrapping my arms about her shapely, white buttocks with the lovely little mole on her leftward rump. That evening I learned that Kay worked in the accounting department of a packing house and that she'd been born and raised in a small farm village about an hour by bus from Toyama on the Sea of Japan coast. The next day I spent from shortly after noon until nearly midnight observing what went on at a pool hall I'd visited once before for about an hour. The show was still waiting for the official green light, but the producer had asked me to go ahead and get started on the first episode because they might not have enough time for filming if I waited until the proposal had formally cleared all of the hurdles. He was very confident of approval, saying it was a virtual lock unless one of the sponsors came up with something very particular to make a stink about. If the production company had been an outside contractor, I would nevertheless have waited for the official go-ahead before beginning, since it wasn't uncommon for TV stations to turn down what seemed like a sure thing in the final stage of negotiations. But in this case, the series was being produced in-house by the station, and all of the relevant departments had already signed off on the project. My visit to the pool hall was my last chance to observe its habitués in action before picking up my pen. I began writing the following morning. A little after 9 that evening, the phone rang. Kay said she'd gotten some ill bones to have with drinks and wondered if she could come up. I'd filled 53 pages of 200-character manuscript paper on my first day of writing, and it had put me in a very good mood. We drank and talked until 11, and then parted with nothing more than kisses. I wanted to make love, but Kay said no. "I don't want you to think I'm asking for sex every time I call," she said. I didn't think that, I said, but I knew at my age it would likely affect my ability to work the next day, so I was not inclined to press. When we said goodnight, I kissed her once before opening the door, and again after. Then I watched after her until the elevator doors slid shut behind her. The next morning I rose at 7 and got to my desk at 8. By evening I had filled 68 more pages. That gave me a 2-day total of 121 pages, which, depending on the nature of the show, could suffice for a full episode. But we were aiming at a show with particularly lively dialogue. The characters were supposed to be both loquacious and fast-spoken, and my instincts told me I needed another 40 pages or so, even with a certain amount of time being eaten up by billiards and tennis action that had no dialogue. Quite worn out by the effort, I went to a nearby Italian restaurant for dinner, then stopped at the video store to rent Eddie Murphy's latest on my way home. I poured myself some beer and started the tape, but soon fell fast asleep on the sofa. When I woke up in the middle of the night, I stumbled to my bed, trying not to let my mind get going. Fortunately, I drifted quickly back to sleep. I had filled the entire day with work and routine activities and managed to keep my parents at a distance. On the third day, I finished the episode. At 165 pages, I wondered if it might even be a little on the long side. But the script for the first episode of a series typically included extra staging directions about the characters as well as the locales and buildings where the action was set. Discounting for that, the net dialogue probably came to a little under 160 pages. The work had progressed at a pace I seldom hoped to achieve. Sometimes I would spend an entire day struggling to turn out just 3 pages, and then, in the end, throw out even those the next morning. When this went on for more than a day or two, I wondered seriously whether it was time for a change of profession. For the moment, though, I was brimming with energy. The story was taking shape nicely. The characters had all sprung quickly to life and begun advancing along their separate paths toward the next episode. And I was done at barely 3 in the afternoon. I still needed to read the draft over and make corrections, but that could wait until tomorrow. Letting the manuscript sit for a day would make it easier to spot any problems. This meant I had some free time on my hands, and it seemed a shame to spend it all alone in my apartment. Unfortunately, Kay would still be at work, and I didn't know anyone else I could call at 3 in the afternoon and expect to join me. At times like this in the past, I used to ask my wife to go to the movies with me, but the exhilaration of a job successfully completed was, after all, only my own, and I soon realized that my wife did not really feel a part of it. I learned not to express my pleasure so overtly. I would need to be careful about such things with Kay as well. For the first episode to have flowed so effortlessly from my pen boded well for the future of the series, so my delight encompassed more than just my latest accomplishment. It brought pleasure of a different kind from when the script for a one-shot special has an easy delivery. I felt quite confident that what I'd written would exceed the producer and the director's expectations. Although I had not been very excited about the series at first, once I actually sat down to write, I'd quickly made it my own. I had been able to steer the story and the characters in a direction that pleased my fancy. I took the subway to Ginza and entered a beer hall. The mid-afternoon crowd was very sparse. As I sipped at a pint of lager, I gradually turned my thoughts toward my mother and father. I'd pushed them out of my mind over the last few days, but now I finally felt ready to take a very slow and deliberate look over my shoulder again. When I did, I found my mother and father beaming back at me. Not that they actually stood there behind me in the beer hall, of course, but that I saw them watching warmly over me in my mind's eye. "We'll be expecting you. Take care now," my mother said. I had fled that encounter in horror, but when I stopped to think about it, neither she nor my father had ever done anything to hurt me. If I were to tell my mother how elated I was at finishing the script so quickly, I felt quite certain she would share my excitement. What I had experienced in Asakusa could hardly be called normal, and there was even a high probability that it had all taken place entirely in my cranium. But as I reflected on those events now, I found myself asking whether there could be anything so terribly wrong with giving myself over to imaginary fancies from time to time. Of course, if I were being tormented by frequent hallucinations even when I was at home and at work, then therapy would be in order to banish the visions from my mind once and for all. But these were pleasant, heartwarming hallucinations that visited me only when I went to Asakusa, and they filled me with both comfort and strength. What need did I have to eschew them? It was only from words spoken to my back that I'd learned the woman was my mother. We had not yet had a chance to speak as parent and child. A mother and father in their 30s with a 48-year-old son could not be of the real world, of course, but if an imagined world could allow such a relationship to exist, then I was ready to embrace that world. The terror I'd felt before was gone. Floating before me were my parents' joyful smiles welcoming me into their home. The joyful smiles of loved ones delighted to see me were not unknown to me. I had experienced them for a brief time with my wife, and also when my son was still a toddler. So I did not feel I had lived a particularly deprived life compared to others in this respect. That my yearning for my parents' smiling faces was nevertheless so powerful as to produce these hallucinations owed, I supposed, to the eternal child in me. If I smothered this eternal child, then wouldn't I also be snuffing out the child's 30-something parents who had returned to live anew in their beloved Asakusa? They were there for me, and though by all appearances they spent the days between my visits busy with their own work and play, it seemed quite possible that all time other than the time they spent with me was for them a void in which neither of them actually existed. I pictured my parents frozen in the middle of some activity, like figures in a wax museum. Wasn't I the only one who could breathe life into them? Rising to my feet, I strode out into the bright afternoon sun and hailed a cab.